Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Emily Brown, and I'm a water resource specialist at the City of Phoenix. This class, Vegetable Gardening in the Low Desert, is part of our virtual webinar series, Hydrate the Valley, and is sponsored by the Phoenix Water Services Department. Charlie Alcorn will be joining us today and presenting on behalf of the Watershed Management Group. Today's presentation will be recorded and will be available on YouTube once we have had time to upload the class. There will be a pause for questions in the middle of the presentation and at the end of the presentation, where we will temporarily stop recording. With that, I'm excited to welcome our presenter, Charlie Alcorn.
Thanks for the introduction, Emily, and welcome everyone to tonight's class. I'm Charlie Alcorn. As Emily said, I'm a program manager with Watershed Management Group. We are a nonprofit organization that works throughout many parts of the Sonoran Desert, as far north as the Phoenix Valley, into southern Arizona, and even parts of northern Mexico. Tonight, we are talking about vegetable gardening, something probably several of you, many of us have taken a shot at, done it at our own homes. Maybe some of you are thinking about doing this for the first time, or trying to get new ideas for how to do vegetable gardening with our climate in mind. So this class, I'm hoping to give you ideas of how to plan ahead or how to adapt your garden to be more water wise. Watershed Management Group as an organization, we're focused on river restoration and watershed health. We see a connection between the decisions we make in the cities we live in and our watershed. And so we want to help people find ways to reduce the water use you have in your home, and use local water resources, things like rainwater and gray water to support your landscape needs, to grow shade in your community, and to create a feeling of abundance in your community. So we're going to dive right into vegetable gardening in the low desert. Yeah, let's go for it. So tonight, a lot of focus of this class is going to be giving ideas for how do you plan ahead before you put plants in the ground. What are the things to think about to prepare your space, to think about locating your garden, to work with our climate in mind. I'm going to talk some about the seasonality of our plants, as well as just how to work with the seasons we have in the Sonoran Desert. And then I'll give a few tips for water-wise gardening, and give you some green practices to use in your garden. So right away, I think if you haven't tried gardening in the desert or in Phoenix yet, there are some challenges we should name right up front. Our vegetable gardens and a lot of veggies we want to grow, a lot of them aren't from the Sonoran Desert, so they're not used to growing in these soils that we have here in the desert. So soil quality is a challenge we need to work with. And I see all these challenges as opportunities. So I like to say challenges, but also opportunities. But soil quality is an opportunity for us to tap into. If anyone's heard of caliche, that is something like it's a really kind of cement-like surface that we might find in our soils. It really reduces water infiltration, and it's a hard surface. It's really hard for veggies and their root systems to break through that hard surface. So being aware of caliche in our soils. Pests is really a universal thing. I'll give some tips on how to reduce and accommodate pests in our garden. And then limited rain and hot climate. So we have very little rain, or we don't have as much rainwater as other parts of the USA does. And we have a really hot climate. And so how do we use those to our advantage, or try and work with that situation? Getting into site planning and prep. A lot of this is thinking about where are you going to place your garden in your yard. Thinking about things like how much sun are parts of your landscape getting, and then also how much shade can you create, or how much shade can you give your garden access to through placing it near buildings or trees. Then thinking about locating your garden with the thought of soil in mind, so soil quality, caliche. Then what access do you have to water? For many of us, that is just where is your hose bib in relation to your garden. But anyone who's taken the the first class of this series, the rainwater harvesting design class. Maybe you're getting ideas for putting a tank into your landscape. And so maybe tank as a potential water access, and how do you locate your garden close to your rain tank? And then a really good question to ask yourself is, how much food do you want to grow? And scaling and sizing your garden to how much food you really want to grow. Who are you growing food for? And why are you growing food? Those are, questions to think about as you're preparing before you even go out and do your shopping for your garden. So thinking about site, I recommend everyone start with a base map. This is also a topic that was covered in the first class of this series. And it is just starting with, you can pull an image off of Google Maps. There's a Maricopa GIS mapping system. There's Google Earth, an aerial image of the property where you want to be growing food. You can even hand draw this, starting with drawing out your property lines and then drawing the permanent structures you have in your space. So think your home, think your shed, any plants that maybe are providing shade that you don't have plans to remove, drawing those things in your landscape. And then this is a place really you're going to take notes and you're going to make observations of just what is happening in your space before you've done any changes and, select a spot for your garden. Just take note of what's happening in your landscape, thinking about how is rainwater flowing through your landscape. A lot of times it's hitting your roof. Is it your roof pitched a certain direction that it's shedding off your roof a certain place? Think about foot traffic. So where are you frequently visiting and what parts of your landscape are you walking by very often? Noting things like your utility lines above and below ground. That will help you, putting your favorite veggie garden over your water line, and then needing to do service on your water line. It might mean you lose your vegetable garden for needing to work on that utility line. Then thinking about seasonal changes to sunlight. So where are your hot spots in your landscape during the summertime? Where are the shady spots in your landscape when it's winter and we have more shade? And seasonal wind direction. So a lot of in the Southwest, really our drying winds are coming from the Southwest. So thinking about how do we reduce the negative effects of those drying winds that are at work. Looking a little bit at how the sun moves through our sky in the Sonoran Desert. So this is a great image from Brad Lancaster's book, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond. And it's showing, pictured on the right, the sun's path through the sky in the summer solstice, and then on the left side, the sun moving through the sky in the winter solstice. And in the summertime, the sun is rising and setting north of east and north of west. It's spending more time in the sky, which means more sun time, just more hours of sunlight. And then it's sending, and it's sitting higher in the sky. So it's casting a lot more sunlight on your landscape versus shade. Comparing that to the winter time, our sun is rising and setting south of east and south of west, which means it's not sending as many light rays onto your landscape. It is spending less time in the sky, so that just means fewer sun hours for your crops. And then it is set lower in the sky, so it's casting a lot. It's letting your home and different objects cast more shade during the day. And that is something to note in your plan, is just thinking in the summertime, what are your really hot spots in your landscape? This is a hand-drawn example of what that site plan can look like. And think, the sun exposure, the sun is can be our foe and our friend in the desert. It is what allows our plants to grow, but also it is, very intense where we live. And so trying to think about siting your garden in a place where you're working with maybe the sun hours you're getting, but you're reducing it, trying to find ways to reduce the intensity of the sun. A thing to note as you're thinking about plants to grow and siting your garden is also just a lot of times when you're shopping around for different seeds or seedlings, you can look into what conditions and sun hours the plants want. Just reading things like full sun, partial shade, full shade. Those are all describing how much time your plants want in direct sunlight, or maybe they want time in dispersed light and kind of a softer sun rays, not that intense desert sun that we're getting. And taking that into mind, a lot of times, even with if your seed packages or descriptions of your seeds say they want full sun, they're not always thinking about what it feels like to sit in the desert sun. And so providing some kind of shade, and we'll talk about your options for shading, providing some kind of shade during the middle of the day to your plants that like full sun will, it's a nice way to treat them well in the hot summertime. So here's another kind of somewhat messy looking, but an example of a site map where this person is just collecting and making note of all the information they can see in their landscape. So this is not, they haven't even created a plan yet. It's just really taking in all the factors that are at work in your landscape. I've mentioned sun. I've talked about, how does water flow through your landscape when it rains? What are your, where are your hose bibs? Making note of that. I mentioned the wind coming from the southwest. Wildlife is a fun one. Some people live in areas where they have javelina visitors throughout the year. And thinking about, are there animals that are competing with you to harvest your crops before you get to them? So thinking about how do you accommodate that? What are the places that are protected from those animals or where they have access to it? Jumping down a community, I think that's a fun one. I've walked in neighborhoods where people have their tomato plants and their greens kind of spilling out onto the sidewalk. And I've always found that as somewhat of an invitation to pick or harvest a tomato or two that's spilling onto the sidewalk. Same thing with rosemary. I've walked by homes where just big, lush rosemary plants right as you walk by, and it's hard not to pull off a few sprigs. So growing food in your landscape might be an opportunity for connecting with the community, or maybe you want to have it in your backyard and keep all the veggies for yourself. So evapotranspiration, this is somewhat of a technical term, is the act of evaporate. It's combining evaporation and transpiration. And this is something that we're always kind of is at work in our desert landscape, and it's something we're always trying to reduce. So evaporation is just, sunlight hits your soils and its water is leaving your soils, whether, water can evaporate off your sidewalk, asphalt, and it's also evaporating out of our soils. Transpiration is what's happening as plants are photosynthesizing, using sun rays to grow larger. They're losing some water to the atmosphere. And so when the sun is more intense and hitting on them, that transpiration is allowing more water to escape from the plants. So we are always wanting to find ways to protect our garden and reduce that evapotranspiration. The ways I look, and then wind is also another factor in evapotranspiration. Just drying wind that's moving over your soil or moving through your plants is, in small ways, snatching up little water particles and taking water out of our soils and plants. So plan your garden either by siting it in a place that you are creating shade opportunities and wind buffer opportunities, or building and kind of intervening and adding something where you're creating shade and wind buffers is how you reduce evapotranspiration. What we're doing really is we were creating microclimates. You're just trying to create a cozy spot for your plants to grow where they feel covered and protected from the sun. And I just think about, if you're walking along the sidewalk, you don't want to walk in the direct sunlight. I'm always running to the shady side of the street. And what I'm doing is I'm seeking a little microclimate, a little cooler space where I can walk and not be hit by the direct sun rays in the summertime. And you see this in nature. The term nursing plant is something people will say. It's just like, plants that are working together to create microclimates and kind of protect each other from the intense elements we have in the Sonoran Desert. And so here are some examples. I'm going to go through a few different examples of how you can create shade in your landscape. Here are two gardens that have big shade structures. So, high cost for all the lumber and material that went into this. High effort, I would say, quite a bit of effort to construct these structures. but fantastic at creating shade for these gardens. What they're doing is they're putting a shade cover over their crops, and that is shading in the, midday when the sun is highest and the sun rays are most intense, and it's filtering that sunlight. These shade covers, they're rated for different kind of amounts of sunlight they'll let in. A good number to look for is a shade structure or shade cover that reduces the intensity by 30%. And what that does is it just kind of like lightens the intensity of the sun rays hitting the plants during that midday. So that is also providing shade to soils as well as plants. So that is helping reduce evaporation and transpiration. Another step or another option for creating shade for your plants is creating road covers. So probably, a little less of an investment for cost and time. And it's just creating covers that are a little closer to each garden bed that you have in your yard. The pros of these are, lower cost, and you have more control over exactly when you're shading. You can take these covers on and off, just lift them on and off your plants. The thing to think about with row covers is how big are your plants going to get is the question. A lot of these leafy greens in the picture on the right, they'll be okay in these row covers throughout their lifetime, but growing tomato plants that are going to get taller and taller, they'll eventually outgrow the covers. And so you'll need to take that cover off to let the tomato plant keep on growing. So row covers are great for, plants that will stay close to the ground, not grow very tall. They're also great for young plants. Row covers are a barrier from pests. So they will protect your plant from, they'll create shade, so reduce that evapotranspiration. They'll protect from pests, and they're, medium to low cost things that you can put in your garden. Another pictured on the left there, I just want to note that, notice those trees that are throughout that garden. That's a community garden. Those trees are also contributing to shade. Adding trees to your landscape, and think about in the summertime in that picture that I pointed out, the sun is rising north of east and setting north of west. It's spending a lot of time in the sky, more time than the plants want to be getting direct sunlight. So doing something where you're kind of shortening the amount of time plants are getting hit with the sun during the summertime is a way to give them, it's just kind of giving them shade, giving them reprieve a little bit earlier in the day, and reducing the amount of time they're getting the direct sunlight. So just wanted to point out trees, one, they can create dispersed shade, so kind of filtered sunlight like the covers that we have here in the picture on the left. And then also they can shorten the amount of just general sun hours your garden's getting. Wind buffers. So wind buffers really, I just think of that as like putting objects in the way of like a direct path the wind can follow. So here in this backyard, we have we are facing south and taking this picture. So just that privacy wall in the back, the chicken coop, all of those are buffering this little garden from direct southwest wind. Putting shrubs around your garden, having tall sunflowers on the exterior of your garden, and then your more sensitive veggies in the center of your garden. Anything that's just kind of a barrier between direct wind path is what is creating some kind of wind buffer. And again, wind it's going to pass over your garden and kind of start to rob little water particles out of your soil and make the transpiration out of your plants happen a little bit faster. Plants will lose water faster with wind passing by. Okay, so now I'm gonna jump into, after you've thought about your shade options, how you're gonna keep your plants in a little nice microclimate, now we're gonna focus on what's going on below surface. How are you creating a nice ecosystem for your plants, or what are you thinking? How do you plan ahead, depending on what kind of work and materials you want to use for siting your plants and putting them in some kind of container, maybe you're growing them in the ground. So there are all kind of containers to grow your plants in. You could do a Google search and probably shop around for days for all different shapes and sizes of containers. There's containers that you can grow vertically. If you don't have a lot of space, you can grow upwards. There are containers that are metal, so those will, handle a lot of direct sunlight and not wear down over time. Containers that are made of wood that might break down over time with the direct UV light and the sun's intensity, but they don't get as hot as metal containers. So there's all these little factors to consider as you're picking out your planting containers. I'd say the pros of using planting containers is you have control over what kind of soil you're purchasing and putting in your containers. You also get to pick the place of your containers. Something like that barrel pictured on the top, you can move that around throughout the year. It might take a little bit of muscle once it's filled up with soil, but you can kind of roll it around. So you can site your plants at different places during different times of the year. And then another thing just to keep in mind is, how much bending down and standing up do you want to do? Some of us want the garden to come to us, and having a container and raising your garden up towards you means less bending, less strain on your back, less strain on your knees. Think about, do you want little kids to get to interact with your garden? Maybe keeping your garden closer to the ground so they can reach in for plants and do some harvesting. Those are all things to consider, is just what height do you want your veggies at, and who do you want to have access to pick at them? The cons for containers is it's just more of an upfront cost. You're buying material to hold on to soil. So there's just materials costs, and then needing to purchase those soils, gardening soil, planting soil, those all come at a cost. Another thing is any container you're growing in is going to need more water than just growing directly in your soils. And think again, sun rays are just hitting the sides of your container and heating the soils at a faster rate than you would see your soils heating up if your plants were just straight in the ground. Things to note, just picking out, what do the plants want in your containers? They want at least 18 inches of rich soil. Plan for drainage. Your drainage can just be directly into native soils. I would do a little bit of investigating before you, put your container that is draining into native soils. Do a little investigating to make sure you're not putting it over calicate. That's like, it's half an inch below your native soil. And then, and plan for drainage also means if you're doing any kind of like DIY containers, make sure there's several holes punched in the bottom of your container to let water drain out. And then just a little tip, and really this is relative to any way, whether you're growing veggies in the ground or in containers, cover your containers with some kind of organic material between seasons that you're growing. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but we want to try and create a living ecosystem. We want to liven up our soils where our vegetables are growing. And so covering it up, trying to keep it cool, continuing to allow nutrients to slowly find their way into the soil is all going to support that ecosystem we want to create, that lively ecosystem. Here's another container. So this is another fun tip. That container, those little cow troughs, I want to say that's a little bit deeper than 2 feet deep. And so this person is feeling that those first 6 inches or more with kind of dense organic material, things that are going to break down slowly over time. And then they're filling up the rest of the container, those 18 inches, with a rich potting soil, something that the veggies are going to have a really easy time having their roots grow through, that's nutrient rich. What that's doing is this person's spending less money on expensive soils that can add to the cost of your project. And then also they're creating a nutrient source that's going to slowly break down, so slowly can enrich the soils and build soil health. Yeah. So in contrast to containers to grow your veggies in, you can do sunken garden beds. A benefit to doing sunken garden beds is better moisture retention. So you don't have sunlight hitting sides of your container. It's, the sunlight is hitting our soil surface, but doesn't have more area to heat up. So generally there's less evaporation happening. Also, if you do a sunken bed, there's more buffer from those prevailing drying winds. And so doing a sunken bed, it's a little bit of more extra protection from those winds that are robbing the soils and the plants of water. Other benefits, you can start to incorporate water harvesting principles. And I'll show an example of what that can look like. And then just generally a lower upfront cost. You're not purchasing materials to store soil. You're gonna have to do some kind of amending of the desert soils because a con is, soil nutrients in desert soils. Our desert soils are generally alkaline, and those are alkaline soils have a harder time holding on to nutrients. And so there's just more effort and planning that you need to do to create an environment where veggies want to grow. And again, we're taking a lot of time, the vegetables we want to grow are not native to the Sonoran Desert. So we're taking them and they're used to growing in very lush places and humid and moist places, and we're now asking them to grow in a much different climate. And so we need to change and kind of rework our soils to make it a more familiar place where they're used to growing. Doing things like adding organic material, which compost and manure, those are ways to add more nutrients and create an easier environment for your veggies to grow. And then dig deep to try and figure out if you have any caliche in your soil. I would say dig 2 feet deep. What that does is you're, looking deep enough that your roots are going to grow, 18 inches, let's say, deep into the soil. You don't want your roots to hit any caliche, but then you want to dig even farther because you want to make sure that water is able to drain away from the root zone. So digging to make sure that you're not hitting caliche just below that 18 inches is ensuring that you're allowing there to be space for drainage from your soils. And here is a little veggie garden where they are using rainwater harvesting principles. So this is a sunken garden bed. And the two principles, so this is another callback from the water harvesting landscape design class. So the two principles I'd say they're using is they're stacking functions because they're using this rain tank overflow. That big green thing in the top left of that picture is a rain tank. And when it overflows and water comes out of that green pipe, it's flowing into a beneficial place. And that's actually naming the second principle is, when water is overflowing out of that tank, you're finding a benefit for it. You're not just letting it flow off the landscape and into and evaporate out of the soil. You're putting it in a spot where it's pooling and it's actually, in this case, helping you grow food. And so, yeah, this little sunken bed it's using rainwater harvesting, and it's also tapping into that, buffering the veggies from the wind. It's creating a wind buffer by sinking the garden a little bit. Okay, jumping into irrigation. So one form of irrigation is, having something like a rain tank overflowing into a sunken garden bed, maybe thinking about how can you maybe route roof water to run off and flow to a low point where you're growing vegetables. Those are water sources, and that's, involving trying to plan ahead to how do you use water resources that are just falling from the sky for free and have them benefit your garden. If to take it a step further and think about your plants will need irrigation throughout, if you're doing gardening in the summer, they'll need irrigation throughout the summer. And then our veggies will need irrigation in the winter time in our cool months too. So to plan for irrigation, the first thing is identifying your water sources. Generally that's like a hose bib or a spigot that is outside of your home. It can be a rain tank if you're jumping into the world of water harvesting. Then plan ahead and think about what are the materials and what setups can you use to maximize water savings, and then set an irrigation system or set an irrigation schedule. So think about what are the best times of day to water your veggies. I am going to frame and share a few options of how to set up an irrigation system in two different ways. One is using municipal water, and so I think of that as a pressurized water source. Water coming out of your hose bib is about 40 to 50 psi, so pretty high pressure. And a lot of times our irrigation systems that are water conserving actually need to have a lower pressure. So right away, just connecting into your hose bib, you'll want to purchase what's called a pressure reducer. Reduce the pressure from 40 to 50 psi to something more like 20 to 30 psi. We'll talk about a little bit about high pressure systems or pressurized systems, and then compare that to irrigating with tank water, or I'd say gravity-based systems. Those are really low pressure. We're talking less than 3 psi. So just comparing 40 to 50 psi to 3 psi, you're working with two different scenarios there, and there's things to do to plan ahead for each of them. So this is just a few examples that I see as really water efficient setups. There are tons of ways to irrigate your landscape. I just like the ones I'm sharing because I think they are doing water conservation. They're keeping water conservation in mind. So connecting into your hose bib or pressurized water, first starting with an irrigation timer or controller. I recommend setting your timers to water really early in the morning. So we want to, and then also midday. So possibly watering twice a day. The reason to water really early in the morning is because that is the time where your soils have had the most amount of time to cool down. It's night, the sun is not heating them up. And so the soils have cooled down. And so when you put water into your soils, the water has more chance to sink deeper before it receives those sun rays and starts to get evaporated out of the soil. So we want to give our water as much of a chance as possible to sink deep into the soils, because the deeper it goes, the more it's going to encourage your root system to grow deeper of your veggies. And then also the less likely it is to actually have the sunlight and the heat suck the water out of the soils. So in terms of parts, it's getting something that's going to reduce the water pressure. Then I like working in 1/2-inch poly tubing. That's an irrigation tubing you can purchase at a irrigation supply store. So it's a flexible tubing. You can tap into those, punch a little hole, and those fittings at the top left, those are little emitters. They're different colors to represent different gallons per hour. So they're emitting different amounts of water based on their color. You can get emitters that are sending out 1/2 gallon per hour, a gallon, 2 gallons, 4 gallons, and it's all based on the color. So you can tap into your 1/2-inch poly tubing and have what's called spaghetti tubing in there. So you go from 1/2 inch to 1/4 of an inch, which is the spaghetti tubing. And connected to that spaghetti tubing, you'd have one of those little emitters that's determining exactly how much water that spaghetti tube is letting out at each plant. Another option is doing what's called a flag emitter, and that's something that you put at the end of your spaghetti tubing, and that you can kind of dial bigger or more closed, and that changes the amount of water per hour that the emitter is letting out. These emitters are great because I think of them as spot emitters. You're not intentionally wetting an entire soil area. You're specifically intending to water a root zone of your vegetables. So by being intentional of where you're watering, you are conserving water. You're using less water. You're focusing the water into one place, which is helping more water sink deeper into your soils, which means less evaporation. Another option is something called drip tape. So pictured in the top image there, drip tape comes in all kinds of sizing. So in terms of where the openings are spaced, the reason for that is different plants, and this is something you might see on the packaging for your seeds or seedlings, different plants want to be spaced different amounts. Something like your tomatoes want to have more spacing than your small chard. And so the different spacing of plants can determine how wide you have your drip tape. So you can purchase drip tape that's spaced every 6 inches or a foot or probably even wider. So look up what plants you intend to grow, what veggies you intend to grow, and then purchase your drip tape based on the spacing those veggies need. It's the same setup really as the spot emitters that I showed in the previous slide, that you're going to want to have something that's reducing pressure at your hose bib. setting up a timer to turn on, really early in the morning when your soils are the most cool. You'll use polytubing to it's the main artery or the main thing carrying your water, and then you're tapping into that polytubing with the drip tape. Pictured on the bottom there, we're growing some sweet potatoes there. So that's a grid drip tape. And so it is watering the entire soil area in this case, because that's what sweet potatoes want. But notice they're different than, another option people might use is like a sprinkler system or what's called a bubbler. And I like this option better because it's having the water spend the least amount of time exposed to the air. It's getting water right out of the drip emitter and into the soil, where we're then trying to get water sinking deeper into the soil, having less evaporation. Using bubblers and things that are kind of spreading water and sending it through the air, I think of that as it's more evaporation. You're introducing evaporation right away into your irrigation. So those are two examples of pressurized systems. And again, there's lots of ways to irrigate your landscape. There's tons of different toys and tools. I encourage you to go in and chat with your irrigation specialists and maybe get a consultation, maybe go in and ask some questions to the salespeople. There's a ton to learn. And so there's a lot of options for your garden. Comparing that to gravity-based systems. So gravity-based systems, and I specifically think of a rain tank here we have pictured. This is a system that the pressure of the water changes with the height of the water in the tank. So when that tank is totally full, the water pressure is coming out of the hose at a higher rate than when the tank is halfway full, and then as the tank water level drops, there's less pressure. The things to think about if you're wanting to irrigate with a tank is finding every way possible to not restrict the flow of water. You want to keep open spaces and easy water flow because it is a low pressure system. And one thing to note is the longer distance you're carrying the water away from your tank to water plants, that means slower flow. Like every foot that water is needing to travel through the hose is more friction, so it's reducing the flow. And that goes into, citing where your tank is in relation to your garden. Where are your water sources, and can you locate them close to your rain tank or close to your hose bib? Some parts to look into if you are looking into doing gravity-based irrigation. And this even goes for, the 55-gallon barrels or the barrels that are, relatively small that people, you can find at different home improvement stores. A lot of those are sold with what are, our typical hose bibs. And so that picture on the top there is showing on the left your standard hose bib that's connected to any spigot outside your home. Notice the really small opening. That works okay with pressurized water because you have all that pressure pushing water through that small hole. Low pressure systems like a rain tank, that is not a great hose bib to use because it's creating a lot of friction. It's a really narrow space that water needs to get pushed through. So putting in something called a full port hose bib, that's what's pictured in that person's hand on the right. That is going to reduce friction. It's going to allow more water flow. So just, if you have one of those barrel systems, first upgrade I recommend is look and see what kind of hose bib you have and go out and purchase one of those full port hose bibs, and you'll see water come out of your tank a lot faster. Other options, so pictured on the bottom right of that image there has a ball valve. So that's a 2-inch ball valve. That's a relatively large opening. That tank is carrying water pretty far, that pipe, and I'll have another picture showing where that pipe ends up. But a ball valve is, allowing a large opening for the water to get carried through. And then splitter. So that picture on the left, bottom left, that is a splitter. So creating a scenario where if you ever want to hand water something, you got one side that you can connect to a hose. And then if you have an low pressure irrigation system you want to set up, you can have that connected to the other side of that splitter. Here's the routing options for gravity-based irrigation or gravity-based distribution. So one thing is knowing that there are different size garden hoses. You can get a 3/4 inch, half an inch. So just think the larger diameter hose you have, the more freely water is going to move through that hose. So that is accommodating our low pressure tanks. If you're looking at doing irrigation, purchasing a timer that is rated for low pressure, Toro timers. So the timer we have in that image there is a Toro timer. The version it is that they sell right now looks a little bit different, but what you want to search for is a low pressure timer because you're working with a low pressure tank. The image on the bottom left with those green tops, that is 1/2 inch poly tubing and 1/4 inch, sorry, 1/2 inch poly tubing. So those are ball valve emitters that you can open and close, and kind of by opening them more, you're allowing more water flow. By closing them a little bit, you're reducing the water flow. So you can kind of control how much water flows through those ball valves just by opening and closing their caps. And then on the top left, those are Oya balls. Those are kind of wicking. So those are clay pots that you essentially leave your tank open, and that water will flow into those clay pots, and then the water will slowly wick out of the clay. And so that'll keep a damp, moist area around your root zone. You can also get Oya clay pots that are much bigger. The ones in that image are connected to an irrigation system. You can get ones that are, 1 gallon that you just dig into the ground, and then you can hand water those. And just a note, with all these setups, I'd say just remember it's, work with tubing and hoses and materials that are larger, wider diameter. Something like a soaker hose or anything that depends on pressure to push water through a restricted area is not going to work well with your tank. Another one to look out for is there are hoses that kind of coil up on themselves, great for storage, reducing the amount of just slack you have going through your landscape with your hose. Those aren't great for tanks because all that coil is just asking the water to take a lot more turns and creating a lot more friction. So it's harder for the low pressure system to push it through the hose. Here's the end point of that. I showed the image of the ball valve, the 2-inch ball valve, and I said it's sending water pretty far distance. So what they have here is that ball valve, they open it up and they have a 2-inch pipe carrying it all along the perimeter of the property. And then they have it route up and they reduce down to a, I believe that's 1 inch or 1/2 inch PVC. And then they have a pretty familiar looking thing there, those hose bibs. Those are full port hose bibs. So they are the ones with the wide openings. And I think this is a creative option because when you're doing, working with rain tanks, your rain tank is always in competition with your potable water. Think potable water is what we grew up with, just turning on the hose bib, high pressure water, you're used to watering with the hose. Putting in a rain tank, it takes some behavior change. You're working with lower pressure water. And so taking steps to make your water from your rain tank more accessible or easier to access than your traditional potable water source, it's going to mean you're more likely to use your rainwater before your potable water. And that's the goal, is to use your rainwater before you use the water that's boated to your house or sent to your home. So with that, we will pause for questions. So seasons and species. We're going to talk some about, how are our seasons in the Sonoran Desert different than what we see on the East Coast and other places, Midwest, where maybe we're more used to vegetable gardening, or vegetable gardening looks a little bit different. And then how do we select plants that are able to maybe handle our climate easier than others? Starting first with just what are the seasons we have to work with? And I named those challenges at the beginning of the class, saying, the sun and the heat are challenges that we have, but also they create this opportunity where we can grow vegetables year round because we get, very few frost days, and we can plan for those frost days and protect our plants from maybe an overnight frost. And then there are these kind of shoulder seasons we have where you can kind of stretch out and get two seasons of, cool season crops or cool weather crops, and then 2 seasons of warm weather crops. And this is one planting resource. Really, I encourage you to look into a lot of planting resources. I believe this one is from Native Seed Search. And it just goes through, based on what month you're planting, what are some good options to explore, depending on the month that you're wanting to grow veggies. I share this one as just one option. I like this one because it highlights the monsoons as its own, as a season to grow things. And also, if you read through some of these options, there are some native edibles in this list. That monsoon July, I'm reading amaranth, I'm reading devil's claw. Those are crops that are you see growing here in the desert that are edible. So, finding a kind of growing calendar that looks attractive to you, that you can interpret well, that has a list of the plants that you want to grow. I just encourage you to kind of look around and see which one you connect with, because there's so many resources out there. Another thing to explore and kind of look into is just kind of getting familiar with what seeds we have available. There's different types of veggies, plants that we have available to our gardens. So the difference between an annual species and a perennial species. Annual species, its life cycle is over 1 year or less, and it will grow, go to seed, and die over that year. And for those annual species, a lot of times you'll see that you harvest the entire plant when you pick it, or the plant will just naturally die with the changing of the seasons. And that's compared to a perennial species where its life, it can live multiple years, which means producing over many seasons. And so just knowing which kind of plant you're working with is helpful. Sometimes with the perennial species, they will have times of dormancy. So an example is tomatoes. You can have tomatoes and have a really lush harvest before it's really hot in the summertime. Pick a lot of tomatoes and then just kind of keep them alive during those really hot times of the summer. And then once we get past those days that are over 100 degrees, you might see that the tomatoes reflower and have another, maybe smaller, but another harvest that you can pick after we have gotten out of that territory of over 100-degree days. And then another thing to note is just, where are you buying your seeds from? Going to a garden or like home improvement store, you can find a lot of seeds that are probably really exciting to see. Your squashes and your tomatoes and your zucchinis, really, they have a wide selection. So they're readily available. You can go purchase them right away. Generally, they're low cost. And they will, with the right care, they're going to grow. You're going to be gardening. That's connecting with your landscape. You're going to be producing healthy food. That's great. The downside of generic store-bought seeds is they're not kind of generally adapted or cultivated and with the desert in mind. So they haven't adapted or kind of been selected in a way to handle our harsh climate. And that is in comparison to what are called heirloom seeds. Native Seed Search is a resource that I really appreciate them as just a source of education and a source of getting heirloom seeds, especially for the Southwest and the Sonoran Desert. Heirloom seeds are seeds that are usually associated to a specific region, and they have they're usually have been selected over many generations, and so they have a connection to the culture of the place that they have been kind of hand selected. So yeah, noting they've been passed down by generations and traveled with families. They have this historical, sentimental value. I think that just connects with they have a story with the region they are from. And then just thing to note is if the heirloom seeds that you're shopping for are native to the Sonoran Desert, they are going to be more hardy and ready for our hard desert climate. So that means that they might stand up to our heat in the summer better, and they might handle, you know, the challenges of our soils a little bit better than the generic store-bought seeds that are easily available. So check out Native Seed Search as a resource for starting to do your vegetable gardening with the low desert in mind. Now I'm going to jump through quickly just, you know, a lot of veggies that you're probably familiar with. What we like to say is brag about your cool season crops. We're not quite there yet to be planning for a cool season. So this is a little bit, you know, we're a few months away from doing that. But it's good to look at and see what the options are now so you can plan well ahead. So starting with bee brassicas, those are things like your mustard, so broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, kale, kohlrabi, all cool season crops. And I like cool season crops because I think the the cool season is just, it's easier for me to be outside, which means it's easier for my veggies to be outside. I think it's you know, all of us are beginning gardeners in some way or another, or at some point. And so I think if you're looking at gardening for the first time in this climate, or just in general gardening for the first time, I encourage you to start with your cool season crops. It's just an easier time of year to be outside for everyone. Next part of our brag is the R root vegetables, things like carrots, radishes, parsnips, beets, turnips. Thing I like to note about those are veggies that are growing, are root veggies that are, you know, the edible part is growing in the ground. Sometimes they like a soil composition a little bit different than our veggies that are growing the food above ground. I think of carrots and really a lot of these, they like slightly sandy soil because sandy soil is like a little bit easier for them to push around versus a clay, a really dense clay soil, which is compact. And, you know, we want our carrots to grow big and juicy. So having that sandy soil that's a little bit looser where they have an easier time pushing and moving the soil is just a thing to consider. And you know, a thing to note is just trying to pair different vegetables that like to grow in different soil qualities, or pairing your vegetables based on what irrigation cycle they want. So, you know, in addition to siting your garden based on shade and soil quality, it's like grouping vegetables that have similar needs together. Allumiums is the other, or the A of brag. We have onions, garlic, and bunching onion. There are native onions to the Sonoran Desert. Native Seed Search, I believe, carries those. And bunching onions are cool because you can, you know, harvest them little by little and they'll regrow. And so you never, unless you pick them all out at the same time, you always kind of have a little source of onions for yourself. Leafy greens, is the G of our brag: lettuce, spinach, arugula, chard. Thing to note about these are they're somewhat susceptible to freeze. People say that usually they'll wait until to harvest some of their greens until after a really cold snap or a freeze happens. People will say that your greens get a little more flavorful after that first freeze. But just know that, you know, in the cool season, if you're expecting to have a really cold night or get frost, do your prep and cover things up so they don't have frost damage. And then herbs kind of falling out of the brag category, but worth noting: parsley, dill, mint, sage, tarragon. Some of these are really hardy growers. I generally like to grow my herbs inside the kitchen. I find that, you know, siting them close to where I'm doing my cooking means I'm more likely to use them. And herbs, you know, I've found that they grow just fine on the windowsill where I'm at. And with the limited amount of sunlight that hits our window, they grow just fine. And then they're easy for me to harvest, it being in the kitchen. Common issues or challenges for our cool garden vegetables or winter veggies. And I mentioned the frost damage. So, plan ahead if you're expecting to see a frosty night, just putting your row cover on there and protecting them from the frost. And just know, frost damage doesn't mean the veggie is bad. It just means it looks a little different. It's still edible, and it'll still probably taste delicious and make you happy because you grew it for yourself and for your family. Um, and then, yeah, just, consider insulating structures, your row covers. Um, on the opposite side of that is bolting. So maybe what will happen to definitely herbs and some of your other greens is as it gets hotter, um, it sends messages to them saying, oh, it's about to get very hot, too hot for you to grow, time to send out your seed and die and spread your seed so your next generation can live and prosper. So those, like, as it gets hotter, you might see your greens start to go to bolt. Look into maybe as they are producing seed, the seed is edible. But another thing is, you can cut off that bolting action by ripping off the part that is starting to flower, and that might give them a little bit more time for producing the edible parts that you want. A thing to note is as things start to bolt, I find that they get bitter and their flavor does start to kind of be less pleasant over time. So once you see things bolting, I think that's the time to start thinking about collecting seed, get your last few little cuts out and harvests out, and then just know that once you've collected seed, you have your next batch of seeds to grow for the next season. And a nice thing, a good example of this is cilantro. So your cilantro is delicious to eat as a green, and then once it goes to bolt, you can collect the seeds and use that as a spice. Okay, jumping into warm season crops, and again, just cool season is a really nice entry point for gardening in the desert. Um, Warm season just it introduces all those heat related challenges that I've talked about throughout this class, and then it adds pests to the mix as well. A lot of pests show up in the summertime, and so there's just a lot of things at work that are trying to snack on your vegetables and take water from your garden. So it just takes more preparation, maybe more patience, maybe more attempts at growing your vegetables over the years. So peppers, tons of varieties of peppers available to us. Goodness, the first community garden I ever worked at or volunteered at had a great selection of peppers, and I had the hottest pepper I've ever tasted from that garden. It was very satisfying to know that I played a role in eating the hottest pepper I've ever had. But have fun with peppers. There are peppers native to the Sonoran Desert. And there's another class we'll actually touch on what pepper that is. The class later this week, cultivating native edibles. But yeah, no, peppers come in different flavors, different heats. Siting your peppers somewhat so that you're keeping them far apart because they can cross pollinate, and your hot pepper might pollinate with your sweet pepper, and then you have something kind of in between when you harvest. So keeping your peppers that are different spice levels and flavors away from each other is a good thing to plan ahead for. Tomatoes are a great summer crop. I'm starting to get into, like personal anecdotes. Knowing how much tomato you want to eat over the season is a good thing to consider. And then also know some tomatoes will produce all at once, some tomato varieties, and then some will produce over a longer period of time. So looking into what variety you're purchasing, I've always found that going for the small cherry tomatoes as a beginner gardener is a little bit easier because it's less time you're needing to care for this lush, delicious thing that's growing on the vine. So a tomato that will grow to fruit faster means less time for critters to compete with you and harvest them before you get to them, and just less time to be caring for the plant before you get to harvest. And then just a few tomato plants can produce an awful lot of tomato. So just knowing, going back to that idea of how much do you want to grow, how much do you want to consume, and mixing up the different plants you have in your garden so that you are producing the amount of vegetables you want to have. We have a lot of cans of tomato sauce in our house right now because we went wild on growing tomato starts at the start of the year this year. Eggplants, lots of varieties. Don't have many, too much of a story about eggplants, but fun plant to grow and great mix thing to add to your summer garden. And then cucurbits or cucumber, squash, melon. A lot of these you will need a hand pollinate. Sometimes the flowers are really large and our native pollinators have a hard time having access to them. So observing, when they're going to flower, you can do something called hand pollinating. You take a little Q-tip and rub inside each of the flowers to make sure you're spreading the pollen amongst the plants. So just a little tip if you notice that your squash and melon and cucumber are not fruiting. Common challenges with the summer. So that's a time like where you're going to see, signs of stress from water. In general, trying to get a little familiar with the signs your plants are giving you that they're not doing well. And, this is, again, this is another topic that you can really go deep into this and learn about identifying the deficiencies your plants have based on what they're doing, what they're showing you. Things like a brown center might mean they're getting sunburnt. A brown margin can be related to nutrient issues. Yellowing leaves, I've found, can mean so many different things. One thing it might mean is that they're getting too much water. Sometimes it means they're not getting enough water. But just knowing that when things are starting to change colors and look unwell, it's the plant giving you a sign that something's not working for them. In terms of pests, really, like, there's different levels of effort you can put into pest control, starting with just a physical barrier. And jumping back to the row covers, I mentioned, a lot of plants might outgrow their row covers. They might start to grow too big, and you need to take the row covers off. Well, a lot of pest issues are the biggest nuisance when plants are young and not quite resilient and hardy. And so just having that row cover and keeping pests out early on might address any future, pest issues you could run into later in the season. If you notice pests, I'd say do a little bit of searching to see what is recommended online in terms of, most lowest cost and just kind of what is the least amount of intervention in terms of just chemicals you're using. Hand picking things off is fine. Hosing things off, a lot of times just like a soapy water will wash off pests. There are biocontrols and botanical pesticides. BT, I believe it's called, is one of the biocontrols. And then botanical pesticides are just, plants over time have learned to create different smells and chemicals themselves that deter pests from wanting to munch on them. And so just looking into, are there any botanical natural pesticides or natural chemicals that you can use to deter pests from getting on your crops? And then just a few tips to leave you with. Site your garden wisely. So think about, in your site plan, as you are looking at what are your well-trafficked foot areas, can you place your garden close to a spot where you're visiting on a daily basis? That, gives you the chance to have your eyes on your garden on a regular basis. And that means you can see really quickly when your plants are giving you a sign that things aren't going well. It gives you a heads up of when is it time to harvest. Starting to see the bright colors of your eggplant and tomatoes showing up in that green, lush area of your garden means it might be time to harvest. Thinking about access to water. So siting your garden next to a water source is a good idea. And then think, if you're limited on space in your landscape, go out and look for a community garden that's close by. Not only is that a chance for you to do, explore gardening for yourself, but it might be a chance to make a few friends and get to share your harvest with other people. So it means more food for you, more food for the community. For watering, one thing is consider hand watering. That is another time where it's like, if you're hand watering, you're getting eyes on your garden every single time you're watering. you have direct control over how much water each plant gets. And then again, just along with irrigation timers and stuff like that, plan to do it really early in the morning. That's the time when your soils are the most cool, and so it gives your water the best chance to sink deep into the soil, which is good for your root system, and it reduces evaporation once the sun does come out. And then lively soils. So I talked about our desert soils being kind of a hard place for a lot of veggies to grow. Just know our vegetables want living soil. That means bacteria. I can't pronounce that second one. Fungi, molds, yeast, protozoa, algae, and other minute organisms. That is a whole neighborhood of things alive in your soils. And that means you need to have, what do things need to survive? Food and water. You need to have a food source for all these little critters, and you need to provide them water. Things that you can add and mix into your soil to ignite that life is adding things like manure, adding a compost. There are peat amendments that are super nutrient rich. Coco coir is a great product that's really good at holding water and also very nutrient rich. And then there are organic fertilizers, and make sure to look for ones that are designated for food producing plants. Those will generally have nutrients that are either set at an amount that is meant for vegetable production, or they'll be slower release. And so there's not a ton of nutrients bombarding the plants all at once. A thing I want to note about manure is just knowing where you're getting the manure from. Like a chicken manure is like really high nutrients, great option. Bat guano is also a manure, and that's something that you can incorporate into your soils, or just create a tea and water your plants while they're growing to give a little bit of a spark of nutrients while they're in the ground and growing. A thing to think about is horse manure is one that's a little tricky, because horses only have one stomach, and a lot of times the food that they're eating, they don't fully digest the seeds that they're consuming. And so if you're using a horse manure that's really fresh, you will probably start to see all the seeds from the greens that they've been eating popping up in your garden. A way to adjust for that is to give any horse manure some time to compost. So setting it aside and letting it compost and kind of the seed die off in the composting process before adding it to your garden. Otherwise, you are adding a whole mix of seeds that you need to hand pick out of your veggie garden. That last bullet, bat guano, fish emulsion, liquid kelp fertilizer, those are all things that, those are liquid fertilizers that are great to add to your garden. I list those because those are also organic. Those aren't really high chemical fertilizers, or inorganic chemical fertilizers. And fertilizers, it's just another topic that you can really go deep into the science of it, but just knowing that, there's nutrients. You want to find something that the nutrients are readily available for your plants, and that are not just a one-time like feeding your plants and then going away, but contributing to that neighborhood, that ecosystem of living creatures in your soil, and benefiting those things. So generally, like an organic fertilizer is going to contribute to that ecosystem rather than just being a direct shot of nutrients. That's a one-time hit of benefit to your veggies. And then lastly, attract your pollinators. A garden is not going to do super well without attracting, our bees and other pollinating critters. So incorporating native pollinators like your brittlebush, honeysuckle, penstemons, things like that is going to attract more pollinators, and that means more pollination happening where you're trying to grow your food. And then just one other thing to note is start small. Just go back to, again, what do you want to accomplish with your gardening? Is this a exercise in learning and trying a new hobby? Do you want to supply a certain amount of food to yourself, your family, your community? That doesn't mean you have to start, in a big scale. Learn on small steps and then grow your garden from there. And then just to note that our edible is abundant with edible foods. And we have a class on Thursday night all about native edibles. So you can eat your landscape. And it's just learning how to identify what is available to us and when to pick it out. So everything in this picture has an edible component, and you might recognize quite a few of these just if you were going out and walking your on a hike outside. So with that, thanks everyone for your time. We're gonna pause for another round of questions